Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to present to you the very distinguished Prime Minister of Israel, Her Excellency Golda Meir.
My friends, I think I was throughout this month, which seems like a century, somehow I didn't break down, not for one moment. You've almost caused me to do it now. Every one of us at home has to recall, is it really only 1 month? But that's what it is. Exactly a month ago, I left for Strasbourg, where I was invited to the European Parliament to present the case of Israel. The day before that, the Prime Minister of Austria declared that the Schanau camp, transit camp for Russian Jews, is to be closed down because 2 terrorists entered the train from Czechoslovakia to Austria and held 3 Jews and an Austrian as hostages. The terrorists were sent away, free, and the camp was supposed to be closed down. So from Strasbourg, I went to Vienna to plead the case of the right of transit for Jews that after unthinkable and indescribable heroism and preparedness to go through all kinds of suffering, they eventually were on their way to Israel. It was not the greatest joy that I had in my life. I came back Wednesday night to report to the cabinet that I evidently failed in my mission. Saturday morning, we were at war. The war really broke out at 2 o'clock. But early in the morning, at 4 o'clock in the morning, we had definite information that war will take place on both borders, Syria and Egypt, simultaneously. We had to take a very serious decision that carried with it a terrible responsibility. We knew that within a few hours, our men on both sides of the border, north and the south, will be facing the tanks and MiGs and the missiles with which these 2 countries were well provided by one of the 2 greatest powers in the world. The Chief of Staff came in to describe to me what the advantages would be if we would make the first strike. I'm sure you appreciate it wasn't a simple decision to make. I took the decision, which was later supported by the entire cabinet, that knowing exactly what the decision means, this decision we will abide by. For a very simple reason. We knew that after a war, on the battlefront comes another battle on the diplomatic front. We had no illusions. We knew this would not be a simple war. We knew not only whom we were facing, we knew what we were facing. The men that do the shooting are Egyptians and Syrians. But the mass of material that they have, the tanks, the missiles, the guns, the MiGs, in huge numbers, this was Russian. And we knew that when the battle would be over and the dead counted and the families notified of husbands, sons, and to a very large number grandsons this time, and the number of maimed. When all this is over, we will have to face the world, the good world, civilized world. And we will be taken to account why the first strike. Why didn't we wait? Maybe if we had waited, maybe all this was just a show and it would never have happened. And I support 100% what your chairman just said about the action of your president and Secretary of State. But we have a Europe that is neutral. And we have a country whose Mirage planes were trying to shoot down our planes. They were transit from Libya to Egypt, coming from France. We had an embargo in England. And we feared that confrontation with the world after the firing will have stopped. I think we judged rightly. We paid for it. But I still believe that this was the right decision. During the war, we were in need of replacement of tanks and planes and other war material. We got it from your government. I said last night at the dinner, with members of your government present, that I believe for generations, children will be told of the miracle of those immense planes from the United States landing every 15, 20, 30 minutes and bringing in the material that spent life to our people. I don't know whether it would have been so simple to get it had our decision on that Yom Kippur morning been different. This was the cruelest wars of all. The Egyptians and the Syrians have been well provided. They have been trained in the best of Soviet school of wars, how to conduct wars. They have been trained in sending thousands of soldiers, practically suicide groups only in the thousands. Only countries that have no worry about the life of their soldiers can follow a military tactic of that kind. The first few days, as you well know, were very bitter days. Days and nights that had nothing to do with what we ordinarily know, so many minutes in an hour, so many hours in a day, so many days in a week. All this was thrown out of mind and heart. It was one big, dark night for the first several days. If anybody needed proof how right we were since '67 in our intransigence, in our obstinacy of not moving back to the '67 borders, maybe this will have convinced it. The first 2 or 3 days when the Syrians overran the Golan Heights and were practically on their way down to the valley, down to those kibbutzim that before '67 they shelled from above, and saw all these at their mercy almost. Maybe people around the world will realize now that it's not exactly the desire of expansionism that dictated to us that we remain on the Golan Heights no matter what. Not for that piece of territory, but for the life of our people, for our very existence. Had they come down below, where would they have stopped? The same is true of the Egyptian border. If we had moved back to the '67 borders, and all this mass of destruction and death had been at the '67 border, where would our Negev be? Where would Tel Aviv be by this time? The Egyptians, of course, have a simple explanation how things turned when the American flyers came in. When your Air Force came in and took over, naturally, how does Sadat say? He said, I can't fight the American army. He's modest, after all. But he had no American army to fight. Everybody knows that, and he knows it. My friends, in all the wars, beginning in 48, 56, 67, 69, and again 73. We knew that we owe our existence to the spirit, which I wouldn't dare even to add one word to describe it, of our boys. Never was it as evident as this time. There's no exaggeration when we say that with their very bodies they stopped the tanks of the Egyptian and Syrian armies. In the blind, mad hatred of the Arabs to us, they chose Yom Kippur. In the London Times, a military correspondent wrote how foolish they were. This is the one day of the year in Israel when everybody knows exactly where everybody else is. He's not on the road. He's not going to picnics anywhere. There's no transportation of any kind. Even people, private cars, that travel on the Sabbath, out of feeling of respect for the delicacy of religious feeling for others, you don't see a car on the road. Either people are in the synagogue or they're at home. And this man said how idiotic the Egyptians and Syrians are. Had they done it on Rosh Hashanah, when about 300, 400,000 Israelis are on the roads, from Eilat up to the north. I shuddered to think what would have happened on the roads if that would have happened on one of those days. And I know it has already been described how young men were called out, those on reserves, called out quietly from the synagogues, and people looking around, not knowing what was happening, saw one after another leave with the talis, walking into their homes and coming out with their military equipment. We were outnumbered by men and guns and tanks. And the missiles that you remember in 1970 were supposed not to be moved, and were. And everybody said we were right, of course. This was a violation of the ceasefire agreement agreed to by the Egyptians. So what? What are you going to do about it? We had a war of attrition, and we had a ceasefire, and for 3 years now, the Egyptian army and the Syrian army was very, very well prepared by the Russians and mainly equipped. And by a miracle, I suppose, Russian airlift started immediately to Syria and to Egypt. All right? Planes you can send off quickly. How about boats? Have the Russians some secret method of flying boats into ports, from their ports, from Yugoslav ports? Yugoslavia, the neutral country. Marshal Tito, who thinks that he's the ideal person to mediate between us and the Arab countries because he's neutral. His neutrality consists of having stopped all the railroads in Yugoslavia for civilian passengers or civilian goods. Everything was put at the disposal of carrying arms from Russia through the ports of Yugoslavia to the ports of Egypt and Syria. England put on an embargo so that they will be a candidate to be a mediator. Thank God, our fate was not that of Czechoslovakia. And we believe that the existence of Israel is a contribution to peace. If, God forbid, Israel was to go, this would be only an incentive to a world war and not the prevention of a war. Here we are after the war, and there was no difference between the men on the front and the people at home. All these difficulties that you heard about, strikes and wild strikes, and all the things of, I suppose, a normal Israeli existence, not a sign of that was left after 5 minutes. And we became what we really are. And there was this exchange of spirit from the front to the people at home and vice versa. My friends, we have a very large number of casualties. Computed into numbers of population in the United States, it would horrify even the United States. But with us, it's even more acute, not because a family in the United States suffers less for losing a son, or a young woman losing her husband, or children losing their father. Not that. The pain is universal. But we're just too small. We're just too intertwined. We just know each other too much. And every time you hear of this one's son and this one's grandson, they went to school with your own children, you were neighbors, they were in the same kibbutz, you've been in the same activities, it's one family, and this is not a figure of speech. Can you imagine what it means? 10 sons in one kibbutz? It's one family losing 10 sons. But even those in the cities, how far is a family in Haifa from a family in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem? It's not from Seattle to Florida. And the people of Israel have been put to a very severe test. I went to the hospital 2 or 3 days after the beginning of the war to see the wounded. Telling you this honestly, if only they had complained, if they only had said that something hurts them. But there they were as I went from one bed to the other. The first thing everyone said to me, don't worry, Everything is all right. I needed encouragement, not they. And to see their mothers standing near the beds, smiling and saying, no, everything will be all right. And the other day, I went the west side of the Suez. And I met with the officers, but not only with the officers. I met with the soldiers. If they were angry with me, if they would have some complaint, if they would say something that would hurt me, instead of hollering all the time, Golda, be strong, Golda, be well. This is something that chatters one, not complaints. That's how they are. And now we're back on the diplomatic battleground. I don't have to tell you that we want peace. And against maybe conviction, logic, we say maybe this time. Maybe. Although when, just before coming here, read a summary of an article of Heikel, who's supposed to be the spokesman for Sadat, he says the return to the battlefield is much more realistic than sitting around a peace conference table. Now again. We have several very simple demands. Number one, we want our prisoners of war back. We have about 7,000 Egyptian prisoners. They have about 380 of ours. The wounded Egyptian prisoners and Syrian prisoners are very well taken care of. Israeli patients from our hospitals are being sent out of the hospitals before they normally would be sent home, because the beds are needed for the Syrian and Egyptian wounded prisoners of war. We think it's human decency that dictates it, and that's how it should be. But we know that every single one of our men who's in the hands of the Syrians, some of them probably are already dead, and nobody knows what will be the fate of the others. They shoot the prisoners of war. They won't speak to anybody. No international law exists as far as they are concerned. And to us, one of the elements for the courage and strength of our army is that a prisoner of war is not forgotten, just the same as a wounded soldier is not left in the field. And this is, to us, priority number one. The sick prisoners, the wounded, must be returned immediately, according to the Geneva Convention. The Red Cross should be given the lists of all the prisoners of war. They should be allowed to visit these prisoners of war, and an exchange of prisoners started very shortly. As I say, we have thousands against a few hundred. They can have them all. We ask that the blockade on the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb be raised. It's an integral part of the ceasefire. It doesn't make a particle of difference when you declare a ceasefire, whether it means a tank near the Suez or a blockade that sinks tankers that are coming from the Persian Gulf to us. We ask for the strict observance of ceasefire, by the way, which we have not had, especially on the Egyptian border, not even for a part of a day, let alone for an entire day. And we want negotiations for peace to start as quickly as possible. Yesterday I had a press conference in Washington, and most of the questions were, what about the line of the 22nd of October? You know, there was no war before that. Just out of the blue, there was a line of the 22nd of October, and these Israelis moved away from that line. Where is the line? Who knows where it was? Who knows where it is? Were there UN people at least on the site to mark the line? Nothing of that kind. But the preoccupation is, have you Israelis moved away from the 22nd of October line? Where did you go to? Where did you come from? Go back. Back to where? Nobody knows. But go back. On the 22nd of October, the ceasefire was to have gone into effect at 6:52. There was no such thing. The Egyptians kept on shooting through the night and the next day and since then. So we have a few problems. And I'm here in Washington, and I've had the privilege of having a long conversation with the Secretary of State and then with the President. And I hope that before I leave, we'll have an opportunity to meet again with the Secretary. People are asking me all the time, especially yesterday at the press conference, are you being pressed? And I said, no, there's no pressure. One even asked me, then why did you come? Because it was worthwhile coming here to find out that there is no pressure. But I want to say, I have no doubt whatsoever in the friendship, goodwill, and the real attempt of understanding from your President and your Secretary of State. That there are things for clarification is only natural. That there may even be here and there differences of opinion is also natural. I would be delighted if the United States government thought exactly what we think in every detail about everything. I suppose they would also be happy if we did the same as they think. But at least we know one thing that we do not doubt. We are dealing and discussing and arguing sometimes with a friendly government that has proved its friendship twice in these very bitter weeks. The airlift, and number two, when the big bear tried to bully Israel by all kinds of threats. And the alert that your president affected immediately was a sign to the others that Israel will not be thrown overboard. And I think that every people, any people that got such signs and acts of friendship would appreciate it. We who are not being pampered by too many acts of friendship at any rate, because I don't believe that all European countries are enemies of Israel. That's not true. As a matter of fact, they count themselves friends of Israel. But friendship is one thing, and acts of friendship, evidently according to their manner of behavior, is a different thing. Your country has proven both. And after all, when you need an act from a friend and he comes through with it, this is real friendship. So friends, we have discussions. We may have differences of opinion, but we're arguing as two friends. And one more thing. There isn't the slightest doubt in my mind that the United States honestly and sincerely wants peace in the area. I wish I could say half of that about the other big power. I think the Russians couldn't care less, not only for Israelis, but even for the Arabs. I've said over and over again, if I at least thought that their attitude is, let me say, idealistic. They hate the Jews, but they love the Arabs. Okay. It's a good enough reason. I don't believe that for one single moment. It's simply selfish imperialism at its worst. So here we are, and I don't have to say anything about you. But it wouldn't be true if I said that it wouldn't have mattered had you acted differently. It would have mattered a lot. And the fact that we always know we can count on you doesn't make the, let us say, our reaction to your action any different at any time. So every time we say we're a very small people in Israel, but we're very big outside. And I want to say one thing. This war, more than anything before, has proven to us we must become bigger also inside. In this war against us, it wasn't a war of Syria and Egypt. It was Syria and Egypt and Iraq and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia and Sudan and who not. Everyone contributed something. We were fighting MiGs and French Mirage planes and Hunter planes and Centurions and every kind of weapon in the world of any nationality through various Arab countries. And we're only 3 million. I think I've told you that before, but I say this again after this war. Honestly, through my long life, I've never asked anything really for myself, at any rate, not any more than I suppose any other normal person wants for his children and family and so on. Outside of immediate family interests, I never asked anything for myself that I can say before God and man. There's one thing that I dare ask and hope for. Maybe I will live to see the day when we can meet, and not before war and not immediately after war, but in a normal state of peace. I know it depends upon our neighbors, but still to a great extent it depends upon the people in Israel and the unity and identification and the oneness between you and us. If we stand together, if we remain stubborn where we have to and must be stubborn, and if we want peace with all our hearts, and yet not become leery-eyed that because we want it, it is really here. Maybe with all these very simple elements, even I, at my age, will have the right to believe that we finally will see peace for Israel and the people.